All right, we are back for podcast episode 2 of Alternate History Scythe. We had a couple week break there um, due to Cole and Noah traveling, and it really slowed my roll on this episode 2 podcast. I mean, we got Cole becoming a COVID refugee trying to travel between cities in China, and then Noah, more low key note, he saw some family in Salmon, Idaho, I think. Is that right, Noah?
That's right.
Nice. Okay. Good. Well, we've got the crew outfitted with better mics today, hopefully. So this should sound a little bit better. And the format is same as last podcast. What we're gonna do is a brief faction identity, and then we're going to do some military history comparisons to the faction playstyle, identity, and different components of the faction. And we're going to go today. We've got Togawa, Nordic, and Crimea for you. So we'll jump right in. We're starting with Togawa. So, all right. The way, Togawa has the most unique playstyle of any faction in Scythe. Usually Scythe is a race. I mean, that's kind of the starting premise, is that you're racing to end on your terms at 6 stars. But with Togawa, you're taking a bunch of extra turns just to spread out your workers. And so the ideal formation that you want, like for your board state, is you want to creep across the map, have a lot of spread, and you kind of are slowly setting up defenses. You lay traps as you go. You want to venture towards the factory. But in terms of your worker and mech placement, you want to have a spread of your workers with an outer perimeter that's like a protective zone of individual mechs, like in lakes, on tunnels, things like that. And the way the faction is designed, as Joy Division pointed out, is that each of the individual mechs are like their own super one-man army. So they actually get all these benefits for being completely alone, like no worker with them. So you want to have like that outer military perimeter. So that's the way you would do it. There are some kind of clever things you can do with them, like when you get to 10 power is you take 3 fights, cycle some combat cards, and then get 2 power each fight, and just lose them and get the power star. So that's one thing. If you get to 10 power with them, you can do with Nord some fancy stuff where you're like leading your charge to the factory with a worker, and then you're able to jump the tunnel, deploy the lake mech, and then go in the lake and block them so that you play 2 combat cards versus them when they try to go towards the factory. So there are some fancy things, but that's the gist of the Togawa playstyle as far as I see it. Do you have anything to add on that, Cole?
Yeah, just with the traps, another thing is they're sort of allowed to build this empire, I think, because nobody wants to mess with Togawa in the beginning when you may get, a 4 coin trap and lose 4 of your points or 2 power, something like that. So if people can attack anyone else, they will, which, unlike Albion, which just gets shit on and sent back to the base. If you want to do something quick and fun and easy, mess with Albion. With Togawa, it's
Mm-hmm.
more like I'm going to think twice before I attack this guy because he might gain 2 power and make me lose 4 coins. So they have the ability to actually be uninterrupted in building their empire.
Yeah, I mean, dealing with Tagawa is a huge deterrent, and then they just keep taking over more and more of the map, and they continue to, like, it's there are so many deterrents to engaging with them, which is good because they like have no agency, so at least they have that going for them. So okay, let's talk about some comparisons with Tagawa. So I mean, we're looking at Japan, obviously. I think a lot of the content might be coming from like World War II. I've been watching the Pacific, so I could get educated on what's going on here and jump in on some of these. But let's start here. What do you guys have for these comparisons?
One I was thinking of lately was what you were talking about is having these sort of sentry superhuman fighters on the edge of where the workers are. It's like you think that the Allies, well, America specifically, and I guess the Soviet Union, couldn't really attack the Japanese home islands until they had, picked off the rest of the Japanese empire, which is interesting because you have sort of this outer sphere that Japan conquered first. Like, okay, Manchuria and China, the main entry point to the Japanese islands there. They shut off China, they shut off the U.S. in the Pacific, they shut off the British in Southeast Asia, and the French by shutting off Vietnam. All these things, so they have this military perimeter and just this beautiful, succulent empire in the middle that they're sucking resources from, you know, through a World War II oil straw, and it just made sense to me when you talked about their play style.
Yeah, that's a good one. That also makes me think about yeah, I mean, no, why don't you talk about like the defensive perimeter, since you can't, like, since Japan in World War II can't define, it's just not logistically possible to defend their entire homeland shoreline. So like how they set up a defensive network. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So, basically, up to this point, like leading up to World War One, World War Two, like no one had ever invaded Japan. Like they had this big head about themselves because the Mongols tried to do it and they were defeated by the kamikaze, right? The divine wind, the tsunami. So they
Yes.
hadn't been invaded. And then in World War One they fought the Russians and they really kicked their ass in the Russo-Japanese War. Um, and they gained a lot of land from that due to taking over like German colonies because they fought on the Allied side in World War One. So they gained a lot of territory there. And then by the time World War Two is breaking out, they needed more resources, like you're saying. And so they just started going out and starting to take colonized places, just like all these other countries had done before. Unfortunately, they're doing it in just a really bad way, killing lots of people. But yeah, like we said, they go through China, they go up all the way up to India. That was a big thing in World War Two. Britain kept diverting so many troops to India. There's not really a conflict going on in India except for the Japanese invading, but they sent a bunch of troops down there to try to like hold them off, even though it wasn't really that important for their like home island. Anyway, as they just kind of get out farther, they're just gonna conquer all these islands, and then they're just gonna hold them. Once they reached a point, they didn't go any farther. They definitely would have, in China, India area, but um, in as far as the Pacific, they got this chain of islands going, and they had the big idea that they were going to have an island, then they're gonna have their fleets with their airplanes everywhere, and this is just gonna be like a connected defensive net. As the war went on, it quickly became like apparent that that was not gonna happen. And I know you just watched the Guadalcanal episode or recently, Josh, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a crazy battle where they kept like bringing in troops and bringing in ships of supplies and like trying to like really reinforce these guys that were on Guadalcanal.
The Japanese,
But
yeah.
the Japanese, yeah. But pretty soon, just due to lack of resources and stuff like that, they started falling back and then leaving these guys on the islands like completely, you know, ill-equipped and didn't reinforce them at all, didn't bring them supplies, but they always are going to defend to the last guy. So every single island that America is going to try to take is like it's going to be a slog.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. No, that's good, Noah. So, what you're talking about was like, so that defensive network that they're trying to use these islands that are outside of their shoreline to create. Like, basically, they've got men,
Yeah.
infantry walking around the islands.
And
Then
this
they've
is
got. Go ahead.
this is way outside that, the shores. Like this isn't, mainland Japan at
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
You're not gonna see any invasion of like once the invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa started, that's technically Japan's home islands.
Hmm.
Everything before that is technically wasn't Japan's.
They've got
So
like
that's
a
just like
buffer islands.
stuff
Yeah,
they conquered. Yeah. So I mean they
yeah.
have like lots of buffer for sure.
Yeah, so they created a huge like set of buffer islands, and then they've got infantry, and then they've got like planes patrolling between the islands, and then they've got ships patrolling between the islands. And that was their strategic idea of a defensive
Yeah.
network for World War II. And like Noah said, that didn't actually pan out, but I mean that's probably because I think it was General MacArthur, who like took it apart by hitting different like the different islands like Laos and Guadalcanal and stuff like that. I'm not sure if Laos
And
is the right
island
one.
hopping.
Yeah, the island hopping. He was picking strategic ones, but like yeah, they do that, and then they built airfields and defenses
Yep.
on each of these islands. So, but what
Well,
I'm thinking there is that the parallel is they've got this buffer perimeter, like buffer defensive network, and like I guess the parallel would be that like the individual mechs as you're playing Togawa would be like those each of those individual islands basically as a buffer network.
yeah, and I see sort of what Noah was saying, like they're gonna fight to the last man and they're gonna make it really freaking hard for the Americans. That's sort of like the traps that you set, right? Like we gotta do it. It's gonna suck. You're gonna go in, you're gonna lose power, you're gonna lose popularity, you're gonna lose
You don't
coins,
even know what
and
you're
you're gonna
gonna
do it
lose.
again and again.
Yeah.
You don't even know what you're gonna
It's
lose. You
like
don't know what kind of crazy
you're taking a
kamikaze bro you're
risk.
gonna meet.
Yeah, exactly. Like they were like is like wild card, you know. So you're even more intimidated because you don't know like are they gonna booby trap this? They're gonna kamikaze like they're gonna run at you with a sword while a million people shoot them. Or yeah, you're just like, oh, I really can't lose pop here. So yeah, the unknown is part of the threat of dealing with Togawa. Like if I knew I was losing 4 power, I could plan it around it, you know. So they played around the psychological terror like the Japanese military in World War II, like pretty strongly. I feel like.
Yeah, well, it all breaks down to their how they did chain of command and how they treated people below them, and there's a lot of abuse in the Japanese Imperial Army. They just treated the people below them like garbage, and then so on. You know, like it's I don't know what the term would be, but it's like the top commander treats the guy below him like crap, and then the next guy like crap, and then so pretty soon you just have this like whole chain of guys who just
Oh,
so just abused and fanatical that they just it's not that hard for them to go crazy and fight to the last guy.
yeah.
Yeah. Interestingly, that seems to persist in some of Japanese work culture today. Just as an aside,
Yeah.
as like Asian work culture in general, that's kind of a thing. You see it here in China too, but that's neither here nor there. I mean, it is here because for me it's China. But anyways,
Yeah, leading by fear. Okay, so what other Togawa Japanese stuff are we seeing, guys? You have anything, Noah?
Not really. I would say
Okay.
that maybe, as far as slowly trying to take back territory, like maybe the closer you get, the harder it gets to take territory, because you're like really trying to hang on to that. Maybe that's something that would happen in the game, which is very true to real life,
The
once
closer you
the
get to like their homeland, the harder it is to take. Like,
yeah,
okay,
yeah,
yeah. I mean, there's
where the
usually
because
most
that is
traps are,
true,
trap on
Yeah.
trap. You just hit trap after trap, and you're just getting it's like
Yep.
a terrible war of attrition. I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Let's. All right. So, Cole, do you have anything else, or should we move on to Crimea?
Yeah. Just one more. I guess the Suton mech, which is where you can play an extra combat card on a lake. If you think about it, actually, the Japanese Navy didn't lose a single naval battle until the Battle of Midway, which was like almost more than halfway through the war. Like, really, they were beating up everybody, including the U.S. for a long time. So, I think it makes sense that naval superiority was one of the pieces of Togawa's mechs.
Yeah, and that's like I didn't
Yeah, very
realize.
true.
Yeah, when I play 1v1 and sometimes IFA's in there and I'm like, I don't know how to deal with this, but like I'm like, all right, I can win with non-IFA versus IFA no matter what pretty much. And then I didn't realize like the naval superiority of Togawa when played around, it like really outmatches Nord, and I had Nord. So that was a huge learning. Is like Togawa can really outclass Nord if you play around the lakes and Navy. Like 1v1, like going 1v1 with them too, with all those bonuses, +2 strength, extra combat card. It's and the traps, you can jump back to the board. Like, it's an insanely good matchup. You wouldn't think it would be a good matchup versus not any non-IFA at all. So that's just one learning and one thing to note. But yeah, I mean, that is representative of, I guess, Japan's naval military success in World War II. All right, let's move over to Crimea here. So let me see. quick faction identity. I mean, Crimea is probably the strongest. It's really good versus Rusviet, which is like one of the other top strongest factions in Scythe. It has a really unique faction ability of coercion, which allows you to be extremely flexible with your openings on a lot of these, because you can keep swapping in combat cards for a single resource every turn. So there's some really cool stuff you can do with industrial board on those openings, the engineering board, agricultural board. Like, there's so many ways to play it. It's very unique. The other thing, I guess, specific about Crimea is that, like, they have Wayfarer, so that, like, you can't hide from them in the late game pretty much. They can get into any base that's unoccupied. And if you're a faction that they can get into their it's a 1v1 and you're a faction they can get in your base normally, then they can get into any base. Plus, with the factory move, they can get like really far reach. So you're gonna have to hide in the lakes, which only works for Togawa, Nordic, and Polonia if you're trying to avoid Crimea in the late game. And then the last piece, which completely warps the game, is the scout mech. Sometimes people playing Crimea, I'll like tunnel on it too hard, and that'll backfire. But usually it's just an insane advantage, especially like it can change if you're against Rusviet, it can be a major advantage, because basically People's Army is their combat mech, which allows them to play an extra combat card if they have a worker. But with Scout, if you can make sure you're really aggressive and fight them a lot, that's completely countered, and they can't like do anything about that, and that stops like them being able to get Power Star or certain objectives they could do as well. So versus the other factions, it's also extremely good. But again, Rusviet and Crimea are kind of the strongest, so looking at that matchup is always very interesting to me. Let me see what else. Yeah, I think that's good for now, and then we'll talk about the specifics with the comparison. So I'm gonna give it to Cole for a minute, since he's our expert on the Mongols, and we've drawn the parallel that Crimea is sort of modeled after the Mongols.
It is, and it's the Crimean Khanate. And I mean, if you do look at Crimea pre-World War One, like the Golden Horde, which was the Mongols in Russia, still had a branch in Crimea with the Tartars especially. So I think even just the way they start off, if you think of Crimea starting on farms and a village, right? And, starting on a farm and really needing this food right off the bat. You need to enlist with Crimea. That's what you got to do to get your combat cards. Well, it's interesting because Crimea is one of the most agriculturally rich areas on the planet right now. It's part of the breadbasket of Europe. With the war in Ukraine, you hear a lot about that. So I found that very interesting. But more than that, they are resource poor. Otherwise, right, you can get your enlists, you can get your village and some metal, sure, but it takes a long time for Crimea to exit the base, right? Mm-hmm. So it's tough for you to get to wood, it's tough for you to get oil, and in place of this, you have coercion, which is where you are using a combat card as an economy in the beginning. Well, I mean, that's what the Mongols did, man. That's what they did. They started on the steppes. And if you've ever been to the Asian steppes, there's nothing. There's nothing there for you. It's a terrible, hard, windy, resource-poor area that nobody would expect a horde of warriors to come out and smash through on. So, they use their combat abilities hardened on the steppes to go out and take a bunch of territory and take over the world, essentially. So obviously, I think that's the perfect comparison, is the ability of coercion and using fights in place of actual resource-rich areas. Crimea being accepted, the area of Crimea. I'm talking about, the origination of the Mongols.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, like if we look at that in Scythe, you're saying they're stealing a lot of resources. One, through fighting. Two, they're using like fights to fuel their economy. I guess in a way it's because of the resources they're taking instead of producing them. And then we've got like with the scout mech. I mean, what you can do is you can enter a lot of fights and like every time you're taking a combat card, which you could take their combat card and then you can use it as a resource for yourself, like over and over again. So I mean, it sounds like they're using their military to power their economy and like power that like fuel their army basically. So that's a good. I mean, that's a good parallel. I mean, I think they're also seen as like conquerors. I mean, they conquered a huge amount of, I guess, Eurasia, like Europe and Asia combined. And like with Crimea, you once you're rolling on the middle of the board, you are kind of like a conqueror. Like you're taking fights. You can take 3 fights a turn. You can be taking fights across the map. I mean, obviously, you don't want to engage like a bunch of enemies and lose, but they can like spread out and gain strategic positions in a lot of areas, attack high stakes fights, and then just make people spend things. So I mean, ultimately they're gonna come out on top with multiple battles with scout, and then they're just conquering like the entire board and winning a lot of fights.
Yeah, and they and they always have more power. Do you notice that? Like in any game, it doesn't matter if you're engineering or industrial, whatever. Like Crimea always seems to have the most power, both starting off and near the end of the game. Even with like engineering, somehow I always end up with like 11 power. I mean, where did I even get this from? They just get jacked really quick,
Yeah,
and
you don't have to
that
spend
makes
it
perfect
because you
sense.
if you take a bunch of fights, you don't have to. You can just like spend the combat cards you take, bluff, whatever. You don't even have to expend it, and as well, like the other person's
That's
spending a lot because they need those territories that you're like attacking and pushing on. So I think that's part
Well,
of it.
exactly. That's what the freaking Mongols did too. Is they didn't fight if they didn't have to, man. They went in there. They had a bunch of power and a bunch of cards, and they would say, "Okay, tell the next city over that we literally just killed every man and made a pile of heads 50 meters high outside your city, and to just surrender." Right? Like you see these guys come and you're like, do I want to lose a combat card? Do I want to put my 7 power against his 16? No, I don't. I'm just gonna screw off and do something else. I mean, they used terror as a weapon. Terror was their primary weapon besides obvious military prowess. I mean, if they didn't have to fight, they didn't fight.
Yeah, they would just like these like whatever cities would just like surrender to them. They basically would just level a previous city in a really horrible way, like super gruesome, and then like their legend grows, and then they just roll in. They just like let them right into conquer the city without having to fight. So I mean that's a great parallel for how once the scout mech comes out and you're playing, it warps the game, like especially 1v1. Like they are someone plays a scout mech before me, or I know it's even coming, and maybe they don't play it till their last mech. I mean, they obviously will play a third, like in most cases, but I know it's coming. I get a factory card that lets me ditch a combat card. I try to get rid of all my combat cards. I don't enlist until my final enlist, hopefully ending the game. I don't take any combat cards. I go hide in lakes. Like, if I do fight, maybe I'll take a fight before it comes out. I'll like the good thing that like the best thing would do is like on the first fight play all your best combat cards or dump all your combat cards in that one fight and then just go basically hide. So I mean the terror of scout even before it's in play is like real. It's completely real. So I mean that like I would say Crimea is the terrorist of the Scythe like 1v1 world. It's so scary to play versus a good player on scout. So yeah,
Yep.
they're intimidating future combats and changing how you respond to make yourself weaker without even doing anything, without even playing scout. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Noah, you got some.
No, you guys got it pretty well covered for the Con 8.
Okay, yeah. I was gonna talk about one thing that's not a parallel, but I found really interesting. Just for the
Oh,
Mongols.
did I lose you guys?
Cole, you
Nope,
hear
I think
you
we're
hear
still
us?
here.
You're here.
Maybe you can't hear us now.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you hear
Okay.
us?
I can hear you.
Okay, cool.
I
I
can.
was just gonna add one thing that I learned about for the Mongols was really interesting, and you probably know about this, Cole, but basically like uh, the Mongols, I mean, like their advantage was basically speed and communication, is how like their military advantages, and how they were able to conquer so many places. So, and they had like different, I don't know, like corps, like Napoleon would do with like when he restructured his army to be like a bunch of mini armies, basically that all had. I could talk a lot about this, but so I should try to stay focused here. But basically, they had like an overall command. It's like accomplish this, but they didn't have an order that was like do this specific thing and then this micro thing, like do it exactly this way. So they had they basically had mini Napoleons running each of the cores that understood like their directive, but they could accomplish it however they wanted. So this is like how the Mongols operated as well. So they had these smaller armies, and then they could communicate and were extremely disciplined and good at understanding each other, like communicating across distance, and like working together, even though they're in individual mini armies. So they could like raid one area, raid a different area, and like the static defenses of the opponent would be like pretty much completely useless. So they had a huge strategic advantage in how they were fighting against the Islamic. So it was like Genghis Khan versus like I was just reading about this. I can't remember, but it was like a Islamic Shah. And they completely like dismantled him by just raiding different areas, and they just had a huge amount of army in one static defense. The Shah did so. But what I was going for is that,
Uzbekistan.
huh?
I think that was Uzbekistan, um,
Yeah, it
if
was
I'm not
like a
mistaken.
lot of the Islamic nation. But the reason the way that they didn't just naturally have all of this, the Huns or sorry the Mongols didn't just naturally have this like discipline and this ability to communicate between their different corps. And mini armies so well with like signals and things like that. They actually like trained. I guess it was during peacetime. During in the summer, Genghis Khan would have all of his army do the Great Hunt, which was like they would spread out across. They would have each individual soldier spread out across like a huge area of the forest, and then they would all walk forward in a line, and then they would just herd all that lot like all the animals that they're hunting into one, and like corral them all into a smaller circle with their warriors. So and this was across like all of the steppes as the location, and then they basically would like be coordinating with each other from a distance, all the soldiers, on like what to do and how to like corral the animals. And then they would even like they would leave the most dangerous animals for last and have like individual warriors fight like a tiger by itself, and everyone else would just stand there. So it was like they were even training like the bravery and the unflinching like spirit for when they're actually fighting, because like the Mongols were like people were very intimidated by their like spirit as they went in to fight the individual warriors. So um that's just something super interesting that was like an innovation that helped like power their specific play style of fighting. So yeah.
Yep, that's wild.
Did you know about the
And
Great Hunt?
I did not know about the Great Hunt. No, that one is news to me. I thought you were going to say something completely different. So you opened my eyes, man. Thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's cool.
pretty cool stuff. Okay, so let's go to Nordic then.
Already.
All right, so all right, quick intro on play style. I'm gonna talk like Nord 1v1, but basically like again they have an ability that warps the game. They're able to fight over and over again, which is the seaworthy, and also artillery, but mainly seaworthy, which is like you can just, if you're staying adjacent to lakes, like you'll just take your workers and retreat into the lake. You can hit high stakes territories over and over again, turn in, turn out, like where the enemy is weak. Like one of their weak points is like Rusvie at Patriotic has a really hard time getting its mechs out because they cost 4 metal. So you can just be pressuring on that adjacent lake and attack them every turn, and you can just play 0, make them spend stuff, and then capitalize at the right time. So this is a super unconventional playstyle for Scythe, but it makes them extremely strong as long as you have the timer to do that. And then you can do different mind games with if you're playing a combat card or 1 power or not to get a combat card, and just really outplay, and you have a ton of room to find advantages and basically slow down their economy completely, even artillery them until they don't have any power to produce if they're at 5 workers or more. So I would say Nord also, like at the end game scoring, if they were adjacent to a lake and lose, they just retreat in there. So that's even higher power or higher score, end game score, that you have to account for. Let me see what else about Nord. I think people see that they're like weaker, but they're very flexible on how you can play them by moving their workers around in the early game to get upgrades instead of board positioning to where they want to deploy from, like in a forward position. So I think they might be maybe my favorite faction. You have anything to add on this, Cole? Very easy path to the factory. Yeah. They're getting a factory card.
Yeah, not really.
Game easily.
But
yeah.
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered it all with Nord.
Yeah.
Being able to deploy outside your base, again, get that forward position, having a worker jump over the river. And I've seen that with Rusviet too. I mean, you can really mess with Rusviet and jump into their base with a worker and then deploy in there if you want. You can do some funky, fun stuff with Nord.
Yeah, I think it's the worker being able to walk across rivers early, and then since you start on your wood, you're adjacent to a tunnel, and then from there it's like you can move around the tunnel. And I think like a lot of the meta openings revolve around that worker being able to move and get forward position, get onto a village. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's like the main gist of it. It's all about board movement and board positioning really with Nord, and then hiding in lakes, getting that spread, you can take combats on your own terms. I mean, you're really dictating. It becomes a very military centric game, and you're really dictating who can be where on the board at what times, and that is just a completely different version of Scythe than you're used to playing. And then you go the like micro matchup versus Polonia is like a fight to block the other person, a race to block the other person from the factory, and the winner of that usually wins the game. So it has some, they're very seafaring, like sea naval centric. But yeah, so let's jump in to some parallels. So we're looking at this as a comparison to basically the Vikings, so like the Scandinavian countries, as what Nord is based on, which is probably obvious from like their mech shaped like a Viking ship kind of, and then like the character has got like a Norse name and stuff like that. So okay, Noah, do you have a point you want to go into?
We can start off by we're talking about the water walking ability and like striking from the water and Viking-esque type things. And I remember last week when we kind of got together and just talked, we kind of were wondering like why no one else like took the fight back to the Vikings, like why no one crossed the oceans to go fight the Vikings on their home turf. And after doing a little bit of research, we found out that the Vikings truly were like the leading guys on like naval warfare and like crossing the oceans. Like no one else at the time period was doing it. No one had the resources to do it. And even if they did do it, they would cross the oceans to find the Vikings, and they'd have to hit like so many different little villages and all this on all these difficulties because the Vikings didn't have like a central town or anything like that. They'd move inland and outland depending on the weather, and they didn't keep all their gold and great big monasteries like
They
the
were undefended.
Anglo-Saxons did.
Yeah, they were
Yeah,
undefended by any military. Yeah.
yeah. So that was very interesting to learn more about that. So yeah, just being the dominant, using the striking from the ocean, coastal raids, or like going up the rivers and just raiding the whole way. Because these guys did. I mean, they took their coastal boats that they just sailed across the ocean, like straight up. These guys sailed up straight up to where modern Paris would be, right? And then early Paris was probably
Yes,
there and
in
raided that. You
London,
know what I
yeah.
mean? Yeah, exactly. Very impressive.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. I
so
mean,
that's kind of
go ahead, Cole.
the lakes and the river. That's kind of the lakes and the rivers right there. You think, okay, you got the workers that cross the rivers, and you have your dudes just hanging out in lakes after battles. That's the perfect comparison. I think you brought up, Noah.
Yeah. And I was like, we were thinking about just the Vikings versus the Saxons, and it feels like being the aggressor and having like the naval mode of travel and attack was just like, it was just so unfair. Like they just had a huge strategic advantage. Like it's like, one, okay, you hit us back, it's like not rewarding at all. So you don't even try to, like, all right, let's say you want to defend from Viking raids, and it's impossible to just defend all these different shorelines where there's different small raiding parties, right? So like, okay, why don't I develop a navy so that way I can stop their navy hitting the shoreline and then raiding all these places that are really hard to protect. But they don't even go to develop a navy. And the navy, like, I guess maybe some of the impetus for that is they were just so far behind, like technologically, in terms of developing a navy. But if they were, they could take the fight. Like being the aggressor, the best defense is a good offense. Like being the aggressor is a huge strategic advantage, and they could go, like Noah said, and raid the like Scandinavian countries, and it's like, well, there's not like a big stockpile of nice resources with low military defense, and then there's not like good resources to live off for the army and to supply the army and like food and things like that in Scandinavia, which is why they're raiding like the Saxon territory. So they can't get hit back, really. They can't get defended as like a buffer on the sea before they're really in danger. So they can't set up a strategic defense of like naval. So the Saxons can't set up, they don't set up a strategic defense navally. And then once their resources are taken, they can't counterattack because the Vikings just like move all their plunder and stuff right to their ships, and that's off limits to the Saxons. And then they're basically just on the back foot because they get attacked by small raids or big raids in just all these random areas. And then, like they're completely unprepared at the beginning for like being attacked in monasteries and towns and royal estates. Like that's like not the type of, that was unconventional warfare. So basically like the Vikings could just dictate whatever they wanted. So very, very one-sided conflict at the beginning, I think.
Yeah, definitely. That kind of reminds me. I've had so many games where like Nord gets to the factory first when I was a little bit worse, and I was always like, "Oh shit, here he comes! He's on the factory," and then I just get attacked immediately. Like it barely even matters what faction you are. I've been attacked with Nord, I think, more than any other faction. Like overall, if I have a game with those guys, like especially as a new player, right? Like unsuspecting. You're like, oh, those stupid blues. I played the blues. They're not very good. And then they just wreck your shit out of nowhere. So I feel the surprise attacks. I do.
Yeah, I mean, you don't know where they're gonna attack, right? So like, there's like you're just under pressure, and you just have low margin of error, and you're just like afraid. You don't know what's gonna happen. They're in the driver's seat, and that's like a lot like what the Vikings were doing. Like you can't even counterattack them because like you do with Nord. The Vikings, I mean, they just put all the resources in the ship, and they can carry a huge amount because their ship's just like gonna meet them where they're raiding next, the rendezvous point. And with the mechs, like you attack them, they stay adjacent to lakes. They just go right into the lake. Like you can't send them home. They're back in one turn for the counterattack. And then there's a mind game on the first attack, which is like, all right, can I somehow bluff and win where I don't, I play enough to win, but I can lowball them really super lowball them, so that way when they counterattack, I can actually hold out and win the counterattack battle. So like that mind game makes it really easy for Nord to accrue different advantages or just win the first fight. So I mean, it is kind of like when you get into this, like very aggressive Nord play around the lakes across the map in Scythe, like it's you're at a major disadvantage and like they just artillery you over and over again, so you can never even finish your workers. Like that's kind of like the situation that the Vikings set up. Just their like they were dictating everything with the Saxons, so with how they take the initiative. So another parallel is basically that unconventional play style and aggression out of Nord. So if we talk Saxons versus Vikings, the status quo with the way that Saxons battled at the time when the Vikings struck their territories was like the Saxons like rarely attacked holy sites. So like the Frankish and other Christian armies didn't attack these holy sites very often against each other. And then they would basically be like, all right, the Saxon armies, when were battling each other, they're used to, they're like, okay, sir, I will meet you on the battlefield, this X field at 3 p.m. on Saturday, and I will murder you. And the other party would agree, and they scheduled a battle time. So that's like the status quo you're working with. And then suddenly the Vikings arrive, and they're just like attacking these holy sites, which I mean, the monasteries and stuff, which I mean, that's just super lucrative. Like they're like stacked with paper and then defended by priests. So that's not a fair fight. Basically, this was seen by the Saxons at the time as deceitful, like completely unconventional warfare, one. And then it was seen as deceitful battling, ruthless, and that type of stuff was seen as cowardly by the Saxon people at the time. So the Vikings didn't see this as unconventional, and deceit, stealth, and ruthlessness were like totally acceptable ways of manners of warfare for the Vikings, and I mean extremely effective and like really, really good. So that was like the right choice for them for sure. So what I would say is that the parallel in Scythe here is that the amount of aggression is not standard Scythe play when you're playing Nordic 1v1. Usually there'll be like 3 battles in a game in a normal standard Scythe 1v1 with other factions. So they're extremely aggressive, extremely violent. You could have like, I don't know, 15 battles in one 1v1 game, like a very intense, scrappy game. And then, I mean, you know, deceit and ruthlessness when battling, the whole kind of play style of Nord is to use Seafarer or Seaworthy, I think, and then basically you do a lot of feign attacks, which is like deceitful. You attack non-stop, which is kind of ruthlessness. You play mind games with combat cards, playing one, you want them to play one, you don't care about because you don't get set home, you just go back to the lake, you're attacking every single turn. And then, yeah, they play one, then they lose, but they win the battle. They were expecting a combat card, and they don't get one, so you're playing mind games. You hit them on high-stakes territory. I mean, that's like... that's a good strategic play, and that's the best play you can make, because then they're forced to play a lot, and then you deplete their military resources more quickly. So I think that's a really good comparison, is just the mindset around warfare between the Vikings and Saxons, and how they were disrupting the status quo of what the Saxons understood. That's basically what Nord does when played well in 1v1, if necessary. If you need to eke out advantages and you don't have a clean way of winning, like you can battle relentlessly with Nord. So Nord is bringing that aggressive battle mindset. They play dirty, basically. Nord plays dirty. And that's what's happening in Scythe. That's the parallel. Yeah, the only other one I see is like they had this thing called overwintering. So basically they would take over, they would attack, and like take over a town or a monastery, and then from there they could like use that as a home base to launch raids deeper inland. So what they would do is basically do this, and then as winter sets in, like right before winter sets in, they can just kind of like vacation in this like town or city that they took over. And basically during the winter, raising armies to uproot them is like impossible, and none of the Saxons would even mess with that, because having an army is so resource intensive. You can't like get any resources during the winter off of the land to like feed and power the army. So basically they would just like live in this place during the winter, stay there, we're fortified, no one attacked them, and like kick them out. And then they would, when it became early spring, when they could muster the Saxons could muster armies to attack them, they would just like leave and go back to their ships. So that's kind of like pretty interesting innovation. Pretty interesting innovation from the Vikings. And I mean, the parallel is like, say I'm Nord, I like take over your metal tile in your base, and maybe I take some of your metal, or I do a produce on this metal tile while I control it, and then get myself a mech. And then like right when I'm playing around your timings, like right when your triple moves back up to attack me on that tile and take it back, like I just like leave and take your resources. I just like dip out of the base, go into the water, and like that's it. So sometimes you really get like fucked over in Scythe with moves like that, and that's something that Nord and Polonia both can do. But yeah, it's playing around opponents' movement timings. And that's exactly what they're doing with overwintering. Is they're like, all right, now you have the resources to finally kick me out. I'll just leave and avoid this entire battle right now. So, but I took every advantage I could while you were vulnerable. So, yeah, I think we hit Nord pretty well. And then, so let me wrap this up with a little bit of housekeeping. Our sponsors. Well, our new sponsor that's coming on board has encouraged me to cite our sources from episode 2. So what I want to do is just credit The Pacific, which is a war drama miniseries on HBO produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, which gave us some of the information. That was our source for some of the World War II Japanese content. And then the other source is this book, which is The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. And those are the two main ones that we used. So thank you to the creators of that content. Very informative and interesting stuff.
Next time, we're going to talk about how to take your top and bottom row actions in real life. It's gonna life coaching, guys. Stick around.
Yeah, how to
for
live
that.
an efficient life. That's the next. That's the next series. Stay tuned. We're gonna teach Noah how to not procrastinate on looking for a new place to live.
Age, bro.
We're gonna teach Cole how to be a little bit less of a wild card. And yeah, we'll teach me something.
Oh, this is.
Yeah, so
we're
We're gonna teach Josh how to eat spicy food.
How to eat spicier food. Yes, I do need help with that. So yeah, we'll be back with something interesting for you guys next in the next month, probably, once we figure out our next concept. So all right, well, that's it, and I'm gonna wrap it up here. Thanks for listening, and join us for episode 3 when we get it out there. Thanks. This podcast was sponsored by Corey's Model Corner. Full disclosure, they are a name sponsor only at this point.